This final section on the African American poet, and we'll focus exclusively on Langston Hughes and just look at, I think, three critical poems with a reference to one other poem. I want to also say that, of course, with Langston Hughes, we are focusing on a particular poet, but what we see throughout American poetry, and certainly African American poetry, especially today, is that it covers the full gamut of poetic styles, experimentations. It it covers a range of topics, but it's always exploring the embodiment of the black person in the world and trying to understand their position in American society. So let's think of the Negro Speaks of Rivers. In the Negro Speaks of Rivers, Langston Hughes begins by saying, I know rivers. He begins by declaring he knows rivers and begins to list rivers. And it's an interesting list of rivers. And it's rivers that, that express the presence of the African American. The African American, he says, the black person, I've existed, he says, in a world in which I've existed by the banks of the Nile. I've existed by the banks of the Euphrates. These are pivotal, symbolic rivers and spaces in the whole universe. He's talking about at the bedrock of civilization. He's saying the black person, the Negro person has existed there. He says, I was there and I built the pyramids. I existed there. He says, I was there at the Congo, the river of the Congo River in the middle of Africa. And I existed there and I lived there. And then finally, he says, he brings us all the way to the Mississippi. And in the Mississippi, he recalls when Abe Lincoln looked at the Mississippi and saw Negroes working in the Mississippi. And he says, I've known rivers. And my soul has grown deep as a river. There's a sense in which that poem was establishing the centrality of African Americans in the history of mankind, in the civilization of mankind. And he also is introducing the idea of the river as a symbolic moment for the African American, because in African American vernacular, African American song, African American ritual, the river is the crossing point. And there are many songs, I'll meet you by the river someday. There's a song about I'm going down to the river, down by the riverside. I'll study war no more. There's a song about wade in the water. There's songs about rivers, and because of course the river, the water, this water is what has separated the African from their homeland. The water has separated them from that distance. So when Hughes is speaking and thinking of rivers, he's thinking of the idea of generation, the generation of cultures, the generation of life, and so on. But he's also identified these spaces, the Congo at the heart of Africa, the Nile at the top of Africa as part of the essential civilization, and then the Euphrates, another river at the heart of the idea of the human universe. And he's saying we were there. It's fundamental that we were there. The other poem that I thought is really, really a fascinating poem by Langston Hughes is I Too. I Too was a poem, an early poem by Langston Hughes. And it's an interesting poem because it's beautifully constructed, because he begins by saying, I too sing America. And he references Walt Whitman in the heart of the poem, because of course Walt Whitman says I sing America, and Langston Hughes says I too as a black person sings America. And he says, of course, what would happen is when neighbors, when people came into the house, he says, I lived in the kitchen. They put me in the kitchen. They told me I could not sit at the table. He says, but I sat there in the kitchen and I ate and I grew strong. And then he said, when they hear me and they come to see how beautiful I am, they will not send me back to the kitchen because I too sing America. And again, it's that Langston Hughes idea is that he's saying that he uses a metaphor of the enslaved person. He uses the metaphor of the downtrodden person, the person who is put in the kitchen, the person who is put in the back room, the person who he says, I am the brother, I am the darker brother who has been put away by white society, by American society. But then he said, my voice is important in this American idea. He says, I too sing America. Beautiful poem by Langston Hughes, which takes us then to a wonderful poem by Langston Hughes, which I think is definitely worth quoting a little bit from it. First of all, the poem is one that he's quite famous for, called Harlem, and Harlem is a poem. It's interesting because, of course, there's a line from that poem that was used by Lauren Hansberry, "A Raisin in the Sun," which is a line from the poem Harlem, and she uses it to name one of her plays. It's a play that we're going to look at in the class, and of course, Harlem it begins with a very interesting rhetorical question. He says, "What happens to a dream deferred?" And that phrase, "a dream deferred," is a direct reference to Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who during the Depression was the president, of course, and what happened, African Americans were about to form a protest. They were going to do a march on Washington in the way that would eventually happen in 1963. They were going to do a march on Washington in order to challenge the racism that was systemic in American society and the lynchings that were taking place. And one of the interesting things that happened is in the brokering of the question of whether they should do it or not, the answer that came from Franklin D. Roosevelt was that it was during the war, and he says, "Look, we're going to do everything we can to give the African Americans the Bill of Rights, the opportunity to vote, and so on and so forth." But he says, "Can we? All I ask you is to defer it a while until the war is over, so we can deal with it." And that phrase became hugely important in African American life and African American society, because it was, many people thought, a kind of compromise where they were saying, "We must wait." This was a refrain that would be picked up by Martin Luther King when he says, "How long? Not long. How long shall we wait? How long must we continue to wait?" was the refrain. It's a fascinating refrain. So Langston Hughes, in his poem, says, "What happens to a dream deferred?" And he creates a scenario where there are several options, right? And those options are all internal. He says, does it get all strictly sweet and dry up? Does it become all broken? What happens to that dream? He goes through this list of phrases, and each of these list of phrases seems to reflect the internal destruction of the African American. What happens inside their soul? And what happens inside of their hearts? And then he says, he ends it by saying, "Or does it explode?" Right? "Or does it explode?" becomes the last phrase that he has. Listen to the poem. "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? All of these things are a reflection on what racism does to the African American. And you can see each of them is something that is inside. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? That dream deferred dries up. They lose hope. Does it fester like a sore and then run? It creates a canker and rottenness in the body. Does it stink like rotten meat? The extension of that rottenness, the extension of that decay, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet. It becomes sort of horrible to the stomach and to the taste and so on, and becomes dangerous to the body. And then he said, maybe it just sags like a heavy load, which is stasis, an incapacity to move. And then finally he asked the question, or does it explode? Which is the first time it becomes external. And revolution, resistance, riots, whatever it is, the explosion, because the dream has been deferred for many years. He wrote that poem in the 1940s. It was almost an anticipation of what would happen in the 1960s. It's a really, really powerful and moving poem by Langston Hughes. So I thought I would end this discussion by looking at really one of his more interesting poems, a poem that that shows his jazz influence, and I think it's sort of just worth giving some attention to this wonderful poem. It's called Dream Boogie, which 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 is worth giving a little attention to. Because of course it carries with it some of the jazz elements. Listen to it. Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Listen closely, you'll hear their feet beating out and beating out a. You think it's a happy beat? Listen to it closely, ain't you heard something underneath like a. What did I say? Sure, I'm happy. Take it away. Hip hop, rebop, mop, yeah. There's wonderful play on it because, of course, what we're doing is anticipating the rhyme. The rhyme is then sort of obstructed and aborted. Good morning, Daddy. Ain't you heard the boogie woogie rumble of a dream deferred? Remember that phrase. Listen closely. You'll hear their feet beating out and beating out. You think it's a happy beat? Is the question. So we get that rhyme, but it's a question. Do you really think that the feet that you're hearing is a happy? It's a happy feet, and listen to it closely. Ain't you heard something underneath like a? What did I say? Sure, I'm happy. Take it away. Hip hop, rebop, mop, yeah. That I'm happy is clearly sarcastic. That I'm happy is a resistance to the notion that the idea that black people dancing, as we saw, for instance, in Birth of a Nation, represents genuine joy. What he's saying is that this dancing, underneath it, is an explosive temperament, something that could be really dangerous at the end of it. So in this poet, Langston Hughes, who became sort of the hallmark of African American poetry, we see him asking these really, really difficult questions in his poetry. So that's Langston Hughes, and that's part of his legacy, and those are the poems that I wanted us to give some attention to.